I'm happy to introduce Brett Fawcett from Newman Theological College, and the title of your paper has stayed the same, I'm assuming. The Challenge of Love, a Social and Theological Appraisal of the Situation of Catholic Schools in Alberta. So Brett will talk for 20 minutes, and then we'll have some opportunity for conversation for another 20 minutes. Okay.
Well, thank you very much. As mentioned, the title of my talk is The Challenge of Love, and I believe this challenge must be issued both to Catholic educators and also to the wider civic society. Now, as a sound Catholic education will reveal, St. Thomas Aquinas defines love, in Michael Novak's summary, as an act of the will rather than the passions, to will the highest good of the other precisely as other. This understanding is, of course, founded in the Catholic understanding of the Trinitarian reality of God, who is an eternal, pure act of self-giving and other-affirming love between persons. Any attempt to erode this otherness, whatever it may be, is not love. The place of the publicly funded, separate Catholic school system in Alberta has recently entered the public discussion. The new Democratic government, under Education Minister David Eggen, has proposed guidelines for how schools are to treat and respond to LGBTQ students. And these requirements were perceived by some, including Bishop Henry in this Diocese of Calgary, as imposing a secular worldview on Catholic schools, forcing them to contradict the Catholic teaching on sexuality, and by extension, the Catholic teaching on the human person. Now, this conflict led many secular commentators to ask, once again, whether it is appropriate for a denominational school to receive public funding. Often they will invoke the separation of church and state and claim that this arrangement contradicts this principle, and propose instead a single public school system which will be nonpartisan and secular. Now, my talk will respond to these objections in three fronts. Firstly, it will discuss the nature of Canadian society, as elucidated by the Anglican philosopher of religion George Parkin Grant. Secondly, it will review the history of the public and separate school systems in light of this analysis. And thirdly, it will analyze the philosophical significance of the situation and discuss the civic and social contributions which the Catholic system can make and has the potential to make. Now, George Grant is universally acknowledged as the father of Canadian nationalism and is best known for his 1965 treatise, Lament for a Nation. In this book, he predicted that Canada would be culturally and politically assimilated into the United States of America. What is important for our purposes is his explanation of what the Canadian project is and why Confederation occurred. Canada, he argues in this text as well as others, was a compromise between English Protestants and French Catholics, who had nothing but contempt for each other, but who shared a fear that their respective civilizations would be swallowed up by the American behemoth to the south. What the French and English had in common, Grant observed, was a kind of religiously based conservatism. They both valued virtue, self-restraint, and loyalty to their communities and their churches. Both the British Loyalists and the Quebecois Ultramontanes saw America, on the other hand, as embodying liberalism, individualism, and the breakdown of the traditional society. Thus, they were driven to create the nation of Canada by, in Grant's words, an inchoate desire to build in these cold and forbidding regions a society with a greater sense of order and restraint than freedom-loving republicanism would allow. Thus, for Canadians to adopt the philosophical and ideological stance of the Americans, therefore, was a failure of Canada as a nation. Right away, we must observe here that the separation of church and state, so often evoked, is actually an American rather than a Canadian civic principle. Canada has never enshrined the separation of church and state in her laws. Our head of state, after all, is the supreme governor of the Church of England, and arguably a country with a head of the church as their head of state would qualify as a theocracy. Grant went on to argue that Canada was doomed to failure and that liberalism, defined by Grant as the belief that man's essence is his freedom, and therefore that what chiefly concerns man in this life is to shape the world as we want it, was destined to triumph. This was because the spread of technology, or technique as Grant preferred to call it. Technology for Grant is not merely a set of tools. Following Heidegger's analysis, Grant defines technology as an ontology, as a way of seeing the world, a way of being. Because technique, by definition, exists to accomplish one's desires and to remove impediments to the will, a technological society is a society which trains the mind almost unconsciously to see my own individual will as being supreme, and anything which impedes the accomplishment of my will as an obstacle to be overcome. Cultural and religious loyalties, almost by necessity, put restraints on the will, and therefore would be abandoned in a technologically progressive society. And thus the conservatism of Canada was destined to be eroded away by liberalism to join its place in what Grant, following Leo Strauss, called the liberal homogenous superstate. As he put it, liberalism in its most unequivocal form includes not only the idea of universalism, but also that of homogeneity. And this was a catastrophe for Grant, as Professor Ron Dart at Fraser Valley demonstrates, because Grant's Anglican Platonism led him to believe that the good life requires a kind of political loyalty, an allegiance to something higher than oneself, which guides the self towards God. This same instinct is what led to the Protestant Catholic project of the nation of Canada, which was created to protect this kind of civilization. And as Grant crucially observed, as much as the technological society would feign a kind of live and let live liberality, in actual fact, there is a kind of imperial violence at its heart. And Grant cites the example of the Doukhobors, a Russian pacifist society who were persecuted by the Canadian government simply because they refused to participate in the nation's wars. Grant himself had been a pacifist, and therefore was uniquely sensitive to the violence of technology. And he observed that no community which resisted or put demands higher than that of the technological society would be allowed to continue as it had been. Now, Grant's insights are largely echoed by Charles Taylor, the Canadian Catholic philosopher, who observes in his seminal work, A Secular Age, that technological secularism is the codification of an often unconscious worldview which enshrines the will to power. As Taylor puts it, objectification of the world gives a sense of power and control, which is intensified by every victory of instrumental reason. And this means that secularism is not merely the negative absence of religious biases, but a positive ideological codification of a technically conditioned impulse. It is a competing ontology to the ontology of religion. And as the late Professor Nicholas Tack of the University of Alberta demonstrates in this invaluable text on the history of Catholic education in Alberta, opposition to the separate schools in the modern age really began and intensified with the shift from the rural to the urban predominance of Alberta. As he puts it, where a society's fortunes are largely determined by the vagaries of natural forces, so is its worldview. But with increased industrialization and urbanization, this dependence was severed, and concomitantly, worldly experiences and the Weltanschauung are altered. With this as a context, let's turn to the issue of public and separate schools, which is arguably the quintessential example of the compromise which Grant spoke of. The father of public education in Canada was the famed Egerton Ryerson of Ontario, a Methodist minister whose work in the 1840s involved agitating for a public universal school system, which, although non-denominational, would still instill Christian virtues into its students. Now, as Dr. Mark McGowan in Toronto has demonstrated, as much as Ryerson, who opposed having denominational schools, he wanted a single system, as much as he said this was non-denominational, in fact, much of the push behind it came from the Protestant majority of Toronto, which actually wanted to eradicate the civilization of its Catholic minority. And Toronto's Catholic bishops and populace realized this and demanded compromise. Thus, the Hatch Act of 1855 and the Scott Act of 1863 created the Catholic school system, which was publicly funded, as a kind of safeguard against the homogenization of a single, nominally non-sectarian public education system. Now, significantly, the following year after the Scott Act, Pope Pius IX issued the Syllabus of Errors, which condemned, among other so-called modernist heresies, the idea that the entire government of public schools appertains to the civil power. And only 3 years later, then, when the British North America Act was passed, Article 93 crucially included the provision that provinces could provide public funding for denominational schools. Now, given that Pius had just declared it was an error to say, a heresy to say, that the government should have exclusive control and there should be no ecclesiastical control of schools, it's fair to say that Catholics would not have cooperated with the British North America Act if it did not include this provision. Which is why Prime Minister Charles Tupper was certainly right when he said that, quote, without this clause, without this guarantee of the rights of minorities, we should have been unable to obtain any confederation whatsoever. And thus the Alberta Act would go on to further enshrine this principle in Section 17 of the Alberta Act. Now, there are a few points to be made here. Firstly, Given that those who oppose public funding for Catholic schools on the grounds that the government should only be involved in secular projects, it's important to remember that the very idea of a public education system was the project of a Methodist minister who wanted to teach Christian values. So if the separation of church and state means that the government ought not be supporting any Christian initiatives, then this means the public education system itself ought to be abandoned. Second, the history in Toronto especially illustrates the fact that there was always this perceived danger that a single public education system, which purported to secularity, was in fact a kind of imperialism which would be imposed on minority schools and civilizations. And thirdly, most crucially perhaps, Egerton Ryerson did not just engineer the public education system. He was also the architect of the residential school system, which sought to kill the Indian in the child and replace that culture with a more technologically advanced and progressive one. Now, the important thing to notice here is that Ryerson's residential school project was not a failure of kindness. It was not a failure of good intentions. Ryerson, in fact, had been a missionary to the First Nations people and had even learned Ojibwa himself. But it was a failure of love, defined precisely as willing the highest good of the other precisely as other. It was a failure of love for the First Nations people as First Nations people. Now, this is the challenge of love to a society that purports to be multicultural. If multiculturalism means that different minority groups, religious, ethnic, or otherwise, can retain cultural distinctives as long as they fundamentally acquiesce to the prevailing worldview of the society, then that is not multiculturalism at all. That is not willing the highest good of the other as other. It's essentially fraudulent. Love, on the other hand, is not homogenizing. And the challenge of love to a multicultural society is the challenge to affirm and allow the flourishing of cultures other than technological liberalism in all their moral and metaphysical distinctiveness. Love, as St. Paul famously writes in 1 Corinthians 13, does not insist on its own way. But the challenge of love is just as resounding to Catholic educators, and advocates of Catholic schools must recognize the genuine concerns raised by their opponents. Ideological colonization aside, the insistence on the proliferation of gay-straight alliances in schools, or on the rights of transgendered students to use the bathroom of their choice, can all be seen to stem from a legitimate and laudable concern for the well-being of the students themselves, a desire to steer them away from alienation and suicidal proclivities into a healthy self-affirmation. Now here the Catholic educator is faced with the challenge of truly affirming the human person in front of them in all their divinely imaging glory. Nor can we simply make as our standard the rule to love the sinner and hate the sin, as though homosexual inclinations or gender dysphoria were inherently sinful. Instead, they call for a strategy which is almost more pastoral than pedagogical. I do not claim to be able to exhaustively answer what that could look like now, but I do propose that what that looks like for a Catholic educator has changed. And our theological and pastoral reflections on what the Catholic school system ought to look like and the way it ought to minister to its students is rather different than it would have been in 1885, when Leo XIII issued his encyclical on Christian education, Spectata Fides. Now, this encyclical praised the voluntary schools, that is to say, the Catholic schools which receive the majority of their running costs from the central government via the local authority and do not charge fees to the students. Leo argued that these schools were not only spiritually advantageous, but also socially advantageous, since, quote, there is no better citizen than the man who has believed and practiced the Christian faith from his childhood, end quote. Something like this is perhaps the lingering rationale in some people's minds for either supporting the public funding of Catholic schools or perhaps even sending their children to public schools. And if the traditional Catholic belief that the relation of nature to grace is a basically sound one, then perhaps there is something to this. But the tensions between the Catholic vision of education and the ascendant secular theories of education came to a head in Pius XI's 1929 encyclical on the Christian education of youth, Divini Ilias Magistri. Now, this lengthy and detailed encyclical, which was really almost a debate presentation more than anything else, argued that the Church's right, in concert with parents and civil authorities, was to educate the youth, a right so strongly asserted as to even claim that, quote, there can be no ideally perfect education which is not Christian education. The encyclical rejected a Rousseauist theory of education, as well as any theory which denied the reality of original sin. In so doing, it condemned, for example, naturalistic sex education, student-guided education, perhaps something like inquiry-based learning today, and interestingly, co-education. Pius argued that co-education misunderstood that the sexes were to associate mainly through matrimony, and that outside of this context, the close association of boys and girls was an offense against modesty, which denied the reality of original sin. Records how Catholic educators for the next several decades, including in Alberta, would cite the neo-Thomistic arguments of this encyclical against the theories of Dewey and other educational reformers. In fact, in the 1940s, the Alberta Catholic Education Association was formed largely to ensure that Pius's vision of Catholic education was fulfilled in Alberta. It's important to note, too, that Pius situates most of his argument in continuity with Leo's earlier encyclicals on the role of an officially Christian civic state. His ideal of Catholic education is tied to a particular vision of Christian society. And this was obviously subject to a drastic change at the time of Vatican II, where the Church can be seen to embrace her role not so much as a temporal authority, pontificating to the world, but as a witness and an advocate to the world. Even the ideal of a Christian state was set aside in the Council's Declaration on Religious Liberty, Dignitatis Humanae, though even this document made allowances for, quote, peculiar circumstances obtaining among peoples in which special civil recognition is given to one religious community in the constitutional order of society. So there is some provision made for a government recognition of a certain denomination or religion. And because of the historical circumstances which has led to a Catholic school system having this public situation, I think we ought to be sensitive to the ways the Holy Spirit can work through that. In 1965, Pope Paul VI issued his own declaration on Christian education, which took a different tone entirely from his predecessors. After stating frankly that all men of every race, condition, and age, since they enjoy the dignity of a human being, have an inalienable right to an education that is in keeping with their ultimate goal, their ability, their sex, and the culture and tradition of their country. Paul says that Catholic schools specifically have this proper function, quote, to create a special atmosphere animated by the gospel spirit of freedom and charity, that is to say, of love, to help youth grow according to the new creatures they were made through baptism as they develop their own personalities, and finally to order the whole of human culture to the news of salvation. And the student body should be formed to be a, quote, saving leaven in the human community. The stress is much more on the witness to the world, manifested in the building of the kingdom, than in the preservation of a Catholic educational ghetto. This is undoubtedly what Catholic schools ought to strive to embody today. Not merely precision in doctrine, but a tangible witness of love. And we are well situated for this because of the example of Pope Francis today. Francis, whatever his critics may say, embodies a doctrinal orthodoxy, but also a love for human persons in their otherness, which the world cannot gainsay. And thus he's given Catholic schools a moment of powerful opportunity to witness to this, particularly in a province, for example, that's so dependent on energy, and which is currently reflecting on its own obligation to the environment. Francis's encyclical on the environment, Laudato Si, is a powerful stimulant towards environmental justice teaching within our schools. Dean Sarnecki has a good presentation on this, on what Catholic educators can do with Laudato Si to inculcate its principles into its students. At a time when body positivity is realized as an essential component for the mental health of students, John Paul II's theology of the body is a resource that I think is actually very untapped, affirming the sacramentality of the human body. But there will always be the sign of contradiction of the Catholic teaching on morality, on sexuality. And I wish to close with these remarks from Father Stefano Penna of Newman Theological College, which I believe summarize what I think is ultimately the, quote, solution to this, quote, problem. Father Penna says that adults like to flatten everything up and make it even, but life isn't that way. It's bumpy, it's messy, and you've got to get involved. There's no way you can legislate away bumpiness, and we can't even legislate love. But the thing about a Catholic school is that we have a higher standard than any government regulation. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The command of Jesus to love, as he has loved, is a really high bar, and all the legal arguments in the world for Catholic schools is all a clanging cymbal if we aren't trying to scale this high bar of Christ-like love. Thank you.
Okay, let's have some conversation.
Any comments, questions? Dad, anything? Yes, Mr. McDonough.
I really enjoyed your paper and your through the context and everything. If I just go back to the beginning, I'd like to hear more about your. I see this a lot too, like in the Ontario context, it's come up a lot. And you can, if you read through anything in the news media on something's happened in a Catholic school, the commentary, it's like CBC News, it'll just attract people who will say, because of this controversy that's being had, why fund? And I heard you mention that and didn't return to it. Maybe you didn't need to return to it. I'm not going to sort of.
Well, there was plenty I wanted to return to. But.
Yeah. But could you say a little bit more, maybe, or do you have anything more to say at this time about how you might use what you've said to reply to some of those objectives? Like,
well, this was sort of the point I was trying to make in my conclusion. Legally, that doesn't matter, right? Legally, whatever scandals there may be, there's an interesting variety of scandals, everything from like a bus driver who threw a rowdy kid off his bus, to the more severe things like certain trustees maybe being intemperate to their language. And people will say, well, why ought we fund them if X, Y, Z? Well, the first answer to that is legally that doesn't matter. There's a constitutional right to them. But I understand that's not very persuasive to the hearts and minds of the commentariat or the populace. So, to be frank, I think the Christian answer to that is to say, well, we ought not give scandal where we shouldn't give scandal. The teachings of Christ will always be a sign of contradiction. There'll always be a stumbling block. But we oughtn't put any unnecessary stumbling blocks in people's way. So this is why I think, honestly, and they're attempting to do this, certainly in Alberta, this program of permeation, of trying to sort of inculcate a Catholic spirituality and ethos. I think that involves a lot more than just doctrine. It certainly involves being Christ-like. And this is where Pope Francis can be a great example to us. But going, again, back to that point, I don't like using this kind of response because there's a kind of pettiness to it. But for heaven's sake, like, as if the public school isn't ridden with scandal too. Like, as if there aren't plenty of things. And this is part of why Charles Taylor is so useful. And I think he's an invaluable resource that if I had more time I would have gone into. But Taylor shows that secularism is not just the negative absence of religious biases. Well, in fact, as if one could have those, right? I mean, even multiculturalism is a value we wouldn't have without certain Christian trends in the nation's history. But secularism does have, secularity even if it's not a stated ideology, has its own vision of what the human person is. I mean, this conflict in Ontario, for example, over sex education. I mean, you cannot talk about sexuality without having a certain vision, a certain anthropology. That's actually preposterous to suggest otherwise. And it's going to be certainly, if not sectarian, it's going to be particular. And yet we're all expected to fund that with our tax dollars. So this is rather my point about a multicultural society. If multiculturalism is going to be characterized by love, by affirming the other as other, then that ought to mean something more, it seems to me, than just, well, we let people, eat diverse food. I mean, we ought to be, like, the government ought to put its money where its mouth is and say there is going to be a diversity of worldviews which are as deep as metaphysics, which we are going to support and sponsor, and we're going to give genuine diversity to this society. And anything less than that, I think, is imperial in the same way that the residential schools were imperial. And maybe they may not be as overtly violent as the residential schools, but it's the same impulse. And I think we ought to be, at the very least, very, very guarded about that. Like, this is why I said that Egerton Ryerson was behind both the public schools and the residential schools. It's the same impulse. Now the public schools have been a great blessing to Canada. I don't mean any of this to denigrate the public school system, but that's the danger of that instinct. Is this, as Grant observed, this violence towards other communities, which the residential school is just a pointed example. Although the history of Catholic schools provides an example of that too. And Mark McGowan, I don't know if you've ever looked at his work on the Catholic schools, but it's just fantastic. It goes into a lot of detail about this. So,
well, I could put it another way.
Sure.
So if there's a problem in reality, or a problem perceived with, say, sex ed in Catholic schools, this causes some people in the civil society to leap to questioning the funding for the schools. So the problem comes down to the funding.
The funding.
Now take it over into, and just to avoid monopolizing, public schools are really Protestant schools that have changed, but like that Protestant conceit.
Sure, they vary in the work
there.
ethic. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And I could show that, but
for sure,
just to keep on point here. So there are schools in Toronto that are secular public schools, but de facto they're 95% Muslim, and students there want to, and they're Muslim. Their practice of Islam is to take Friday afternoon off for prayer. Well, their practice of prayer, I think you've likely seen this in the news, right? So there's controversy over how come the boys sit in the front and the girls sit in the back of the room in this practice. When that's deemed unacceptable for the school, let's pick all the kids up. They must go down to the street to the mosque, so we don't have this structure inside the school. But the problem in this case is put on the students, and it's put on Islam, and it's not put on the school.
Yeah, for sure.
In that sense. So there's this incongruity. If there's a problem with like gay, lesbian kids in the Catholic school, that's the Catholic school problem.
Sure.
Nobody's saying why are we funding a system that is not accommodating to Islam. It's just a...
Well, that's intriguing in its own right, because you could... What's the government for? Is it not to... Certainly the encyclicals would say this, but I mean, the government's there to help the parents in the education of the child. One would sort of suppose that would follow from a democratic structure, too. So my thought is, if 95% of the people at this school are Muslim, oughtn't the schools and the government that's behind the schools be serving their needs, right? Oughtn't they be complying with their wishes, right? So you see, even that example to me sort of goes to the point, rather, that, well, no, even if we're serving you, you're going to damn well do it on our terms, So to me, that goes to the point that it is still very imperialistic, and it's a secular agenda, a post-Christian secular agenda too, you might say, right? With a post-Christian idea of gender relations and equality and roles and so forth. So, in that sense, there's a certain degree to which, I don't think you can avoid being scandalizing. But I think someone like Pope Francis, Pope Francis has said that gender theory is as destructive in the anthropological sphere as nuclear weapons are in the physical sphere. Right? Now, that is a bolder statement than anyone on the Alberta Catholic School Board has said. But yet, Pope Francis's love is so palpable. The fact that he's hugged transgender people and met with same-sex couples, that nobody can gainsay that he loves them. And people have a lot more forbearance when they can perceive that love. So this is why the challenge of love, I would argue, is issued both to the civic society, which claims to be multicultural, but also to Catholic education and Catholic educators. We need to show to the world that this is something valuable and this is something worthy. In the States, Catholic schools have that reputation, right, for being really high-quality schools. And I know Catholics who will argue on the other side. They say, well, Catholic schools in Alberta ought to be privatized because then we could be better Catholics. Then we wouldn't be corrupted by the influences of the state. I don't actually dispute that, but as I said, I think given the unique situation the Catholic schools have, we have an opportunity to witness to the world that we shouldn't squander. And hopefully this can be a case where we fulfill that. I don't know. Do you want to follow up on that? Or?
No, only in procedural terms.
Sure. I mean, in Ontario, too, going back to George Grant later wrote Technology and Empire. And he has an essay in there, because of course he lived in Ontario, on whether Catholic schools... In fact, I have the quote here. I'll see if I can pull it up. I skipped over it because of my time constraints. But he actually spoke on the question of, do Catholic schools in Ontario have a right to public funding? And if I remember right, it was in the 60s that kind of became more formalized, right, in Ontario. It was sort of contentious before then in ways it wasn't as much in Alberta. But here we go. Grant spoke on Catholic education in Ontario, and he said that, quote, the right of a particular religion to public status, within the conservative account of the matter, is a right of tradition. That is, a right based on the dominant ethos of a particular society. And he said that since the ethos was being technologized, Catholic education would lose its right. I think that's true. It's always in a technological urban society where we're on. as Heidegger would say, the ontology of a technological society is if something impedes your will, or if something impedes people's desire to do what they want, well, it's just extraneous, whether that's civic loyalties or religious loyalties or traditions or whatever. They're just disposable. And that's a deeply felt, it's an ontology, it's a way of being, it's almost not a belief. So that's not something you can just fix overnight or anything. But the witness of love can kind of fly past those watchful dragons of the mind, I think. So. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm from Kings, so
yeah.
And we've done a lot of thinking about this too from the Protestant perspective. It's a great paper that you've given. I really enjoyed it. But one of the things that Protestants don't have, right? Well, some Protestants do, but not in the same way as Roman Catholics do, is bishops.
Yes.
And bishops involved in the governance of the Catholic schools and in the sort of retention of their Catholic identity, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you could kind of put the bishop and the minister, say the minister of education, alongside each other and talk a little bit about how those negotiations happen. I know you've also got the school board and other things as well. But what really seems to have angered people in Edmonton, like I read the comments section of online articles, which is always a bad thing to do, right?
I don't know why you subject yourself. I don't know why I subject myself.
Yeah, but it's kind of like, who is this bishop, right?
He's out of touch old man.
Yeah, to talk to kids about education, what qualifies him, and that sort of thing. So there's in the Catholic way, there's this additional kind of layer of the church hierarchy being present in the schools.
So is your question then like sort of, well, what's precise? I don't want to answer something you haven't asked. I'm not
sure that I can narrow the question down, but I guess I'm wondering about what role do bishops play in the governance of the Catholic Church?
Sure. Well, yeah, part of those errors that are condemned by Pius and others is, that civic authorities alone have control of education and ecclesiastical authorities have no control of them. Look, I have always answers that won't be satisfying to the populace. If there's a constitutional right to a Catholic school, and we go by Cyprian's definition, Clement's definition, Augustine's definition, that by definition means under the authority of a bishop. Like that's you can make a strong legal case that that's what that means. So if people bristle against that, I suppose it's the same instinct that makes people not want to be monarchists anymore.
Yeah.
I would go back again to Pope Francis, actually, where Francis is perceived as being very... Francis has relinquished none of the rights of the Roman pontiff, all right? But people don't seem to mind, because it's so clear he's giving voice to his different bishops, he's giving voice to the laity. Now, that's a pastoral style which is more of an art than a science, right? But I think something like that gives us a glimpse into a way that a bishop can exercise his pastoral authority in a way that isn't perceived as being undemocratic or counter or theocratic or whatever the case may be. I think you can probably look at different examples of this. Even going back to St. Clement. This would be a whole paper in itself. But like St. Clement in the year 90 AD, writing to the Corinthians and kind of gently urging them, why don't you get along better? Why don't you be more like Christ? And we know that even at that time, the See of Rome had a unique authority, but Clement doesn't write that way. His appeal is very much as a brother bishop or as a brother in Christ and so forth. As Augustine says, for you I am a bishop, but among you I am a Christian. So there's probably a pastoral style of leadership, and that gets into its own. You could have a whole conference on that alone. And I guess it's on the bishops then to kind of perceive, well, how do we reassess our... This is why Vatican II is so important. This is why I contrasted Paul with Pius. We're in a situation more like the 5th century now, I think, with bishops. They may still have these kind of legal rights, but it's more like at the time of Gregory or something. Gregory the Great. When Gregory the Great was actually like convincing barbarian hordes to stop destroying towns. He just went to them and reasoned with them, and they sort of, relented based on the example or on the testimony. And Leo the Great too, I think, did similar things. We're in that kind of position. I think bishops need to kind of reassess where they are in that sense. I'm going to go back to that model, to where bishops were even the main theologians, right? But they were the ones who provided cohesion to the community by their example. They can't just rest on their vestments anymore. So, and this isn't to say that Bishop Henry or Archbishop Smith are doing that, but the goalposts have changed. Society has changed. Francis is very alert to that, and I think we could probably learn from that. And so, and I really do think that if, again, someone like Francis, people don't mind that he has all these prerogatives. It seems so.
But in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, the Catholic schools are the people's schools in law. Like the people elect the governors of them, and it's the board that governs them. And the role of the bishop, in various terms, is formal. In order to call those schools Catholic, it has to have the bishop's approval. But the bishop is not legally in charge of those.
But he's allowed to withhold that approval, though, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So
and that won't stop the schools from referring to the bishops, and that doesn't stop the culture from enabling the school boards to refer to the bishops for their authority. But legally, no, they are the people's schools. That's why you can have a school board member in Edmonton speak up against the what was it? It was the transgender policy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, like where I live in Victoria, the Catholic schools are diocesan schools, and the bishop is chair of the school board in addition to being chair, and so that's a different it's a different structure. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, they're lay schools in the three provinces and the three territories. Nunavut just doesn't have it.
Sure. Well, and that's precisely why some Catholics would be perfectly happy going with that model, and I wouldn't be troubled by it. But I want us to be alert to the possibilities we have now. Given our the fact that we have public status, right now, that we have this privilege, that a lot of people are able to send their children to Catholic schools and elect to, who aren't necessarily Catholic and everything. We have this opportunity to witness in ways that we wouldn't necessarily in other situations. Although there's advantages to them too.
Well, even Cardinal Collins gets vilified for his stance on gay-straight alliance and transgender. If you want to go to the St. Jerome's website, he gave the lecture in the Catholic Experience 2-3 years ago. And someone stood up in the comments at the end of his talk and said something, I'll paraphrase, like, we have Muslim kids coming to our schools, and the bishop stopped that person right there and says, these are not like our schools only for Catholics.
Sure.
Admit everybody, right? So, and that's within the Orthodoxy too.
Yeah, sure.
If you pick up Thomas Groom's book, Educating for Life, first thing, you're familiar with it.
Yeah.
So it's Lahore, Pakistan, and it's run by a religious congregation of nuns, and it's all Muslims.
Sure.
But, so there's lots of models of Catholic school, and I think that gets underappreciated.
I think you're right
in all these discussions. Sometimes they're social service for people. Sometimes they're formation for people. Sometimes that all exists in one building.
Yeah. That's a good point. We've whittled down our time. Does anyone have any questions in the last 2 minutes? Well, all right. Thank you so much for the interaction. I really enjoyed it. And,
Stephen, can you just set up a little bit?
I'll clear the way for you here.